Hello, Ed here from Simple Human Action. I was recently asked the best question of the decade. How is inflation a tax? My friend was listening to an interview with a PhD economist, and he made the comment that inflation was not a tax, it was just inflation. This is a despicable and deceptive lie that has become dogma for the monetary establishment. However, politicians and economists in general are adrift with the problem of inflation and its definition. In this matter, definitions are important. Up to the 1970s, inflation in an economic sense still had the definition that the classical economists had understood from the 1700s. In the dictionary at that time, inflation was still defined as the act of inflating, the sharp increase in the amount of money and credit causing advances in the price level. Inflationist, one who causes or believes in manipulated expansion of prices. This is the definition in the 1980 Webster's Dictionary. It was clearly understood that inflation was the increase of the money or currency supply and the increase of credit within the economy. It is critical to understand that inflation is the increase in the supply of money and credit in the economy. The resulting price increases are the symptom of the inflation of the money supply. Understanding this manipulated change in the definition of inflation is a prerequisite for understanding how inflation is a tax on most citizens. Since the 1990s, there has been a deliberate policy at state level to move the definition of inflation to mean price increases or inflation of the price levels. Every state wants to print money to meet its objectives, usually to win the next election or fight a war. It wants to do this with impunity, and it wants ever-increasing authority to control economic outcomes through the pretense of protecting the public. To this end, the governments and their central banks have a vested interest in distracting people away from the devastating effects of this practice of inflation. While governments and banks will profit from this practice, the people who suffer the most from inflation are those who rely upon the purchasing power of the currency, and they trust that it is an honest and sound form of purchasing power. These people may be pension holders, fixed income people, lower income individuals who suffer from the rising prices, and business people who can no longer make economic calculation into the future for their cost and revenue inputs. Does that sound like most people you know? John Maynard Keynes was aware of this. This is a quote from his Economic Consequences of the Peace, written soon after the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. This is very important, so please indulge me while I read this extract. Lenin is said to have declared that the best way to destroy the capitalist system was to debauch the currency. By a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate, secretly and unobserved, an important part of the wealth of their citizens. By this method, they not only confiscate, but they confiscate arbitrarily. And while the process impoverishes many, it actually enriches some. The sight of this arbitrary rearrangement of riches strikes not only at security, but also at confidence in the equity of the existing distribution of wealth. Those to whom the system brings windfalls beyond their deserts and even beyond their expectations or desires become profiteers, who are the object of the hatred of the bourgeoisie, whom the inflationism has impoverished, not less than of the proletariat. As the inflation proceeds and the real value of the currency fluctuates wildly from month to month, all permanent relations between debtors and creditors, which form the ultimate foundation of capitalism, become so utterly disordered as to be almost meaningless, and the process of wealth getting degenerates into a gamble and a lottery. He went on to say, Lenin was certainly right. There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and does it in a manner which not one man in a million can diagnose. And a very quick quote from Felix Summary in his memoirs, The Raven of Zurich. The state alone is responsible for inflation. Inflation without government, or indeed against government, is impossible. So the question is, why is inflation a tax? Or why is inflation theft by the state? More definitions will be helpful and essential. Money is gold and sometimes silver. In 1912, J.P. Morgan was asked in Congress what exactly money was. He replied that money is gold, everything else is credit. Dollars, pounds, euros, and yen are today money substitutes, or, to be generous, media of exchange. One can make the case that they are no more now than government tokens. When gold and silver were money, they were exact measurements of value. For example, a Roman silver denarius was to be struck to 70.5 grains of silver, and 6 of these denarii were reckoned a full ounce of 423 grains of silver. The Greek drachma followed the same principle, as did early European coinage. Exact weights and measurements were essential and expected for a functioning economy, and to allow people to make economic calculation. Trust in honest money was critical. As of August the 15th, 1971, our currencies have been pure fiat in that they are not backed by gold. This was the date when President Nixon took America off the gold standard as it related to the world's reserve currency, the US dollar. They are now backed only by the trust and faith in the issuer. Herein lies the problem. The circulating volume of currency sets the price level for goods and services in the economy. We rely upon the integrity of the media of exchange to transact with each other and understand the price of goods and services. When there is an increase in the volume of circulating currency, its abundance becomes recognized by the public within a short period of time, usually less than 2 years. It is effectively acknowledged as a dilution of the purchasing power of the currency, and most prices of goods and services will begin to rise. This very phenomenon has been documented for over 2,000 years. Today, when most people see their house price rise, they tell themselves that it is going up in value. It has not gone up in value. It is nothing more than the currency losing its purchasing power. So, how is inflation an unseen tax on a population? When a government is unable to raise adequate taxes from its citizens to pay for its spending wants, it prints into existence currency in the form of bonds that are sold to banks, pension funds, insurance companies, and foreign investors, and, in particular, foreign governments needing to cover trade balances. The funds raised in this manner are spent by governments on various initiatives. The government has to pay interest to the bondholders, and these interest payments are now rising significantly as interest rates rise. These interest payments are supposed to be paid through tax revenues. In the absence of adequate tax revenue, the government has to resort to creating more bonds to sell to whomever it can find in order to pay the rising interest costs for the bonds that roll over to the new rates. Under these conditions, higher interest rates are demanded by buyers of such bonds as the fact becomes clear that the printing of currency is becoming endemic. This is a debt loop that governments now cannot escape. This process creates more currency within the economy, and with it, price rises continue as the loss of purchasing power of the currency becomes better understood by the wider population. As the government meets its objectives by creating currency in the form of bonds for stimulus payments or COVID aid payments or 900,000 for arms for Ukraine, etc. The symptom is higher prices for goods and services that the population has to pay. The inflated prices that the public has to pay takes away or taxes away from them their wealth that they could have used otherwise. People on fixed or limited incomes are the hardest hit, as the currency that they had saved for their retirements has lost an increasing percentage of its purchasing power. It is impoverishment by the state. The other injury created is the elevated interest rates that always go hand in hand with inflationary behavior. Under volatile interest rate policy, economic calculation is impossible. Further elevated interest rates exacerbates economic difficulties within the economy. Governments have no money. They can only spend taxpayer money. Inflation of the money supply is spending taxpayer money before it has even been earned by the taxpayer. It is, therefore, the unseen tax that even our unborn children and grandchildren have not yet earned. Inflation becomes intergenerational impoverishment. And with that, I will leave you in peace. Thank you for your endurance, and I hope I will see you in the next video. All we need is simple human action.